How we doing here, guys? Today I'm going to talk to you about worship in the early church. Now, what we need to understand is that we have limited knowledge as to what the early church looked like and what they were doing when it came to what we call church today. The assembly, the gathering, what we call church in the 21st century. It's easy to claim that they were going house to house exclusively and following the prescription of Paul in his letters to the churches. When scripture mentions that they were going house to house, that is descriptive language, a descriptive passage. When Paul is writing to them about the order in the church, that right there is prescriptive. One thing we need to understand is that the early church didn't just disconnect from Judaism like a lot of people might believe. Really what was happening is that these early Christians were still Jewish in their tradition, and many continued to follow the traditions of praying certain hours like we find there in the book of Acts. Now, many scholars and church historians believe that the Christian church gets moved out of the synagogue at around CE 100 when Gamaliel II is in control. And what he does is he sweeps all of the synagogues of all the parties that he believes are heretical. Now, the Christians are now not allowed to meet in the synagogue, and so the church begins a new phase. A document outside of the New Testament that gives us some information as to what perhaps was happening there in the early church is the Didache. But the earliest copy that we have is from the 11th century. I believe it was 1056, and it was discovered in the 19th century. The only reason we know it is earlier, it's because of a church father by the name of Clement of Alexandria that quotes the Didache in the 2nd century. Now, there's a lot of debate as to where the early church was meeting in the 1st century. A lot of people say that they were perhaps meeting in the synagogues until Gamaliel II kicks them out. Others say that there's no evidence of that, but again, there's no evidence of them not meeting there. So the reality is that we have to be humble and say that we don't really know. It could be either or. Also, you and I understand that the church, it's not a building. The church is not a house. The church is not a building on the corner of the street. The church is the people of God. So the topic today is, did the early church worship? Now let's go ahead and jump here to the blackboard and define what worship is. The English word for worship derives from the Old English term worthskape, which means acknowledgement of worth or worthiness. Now, it's important because there are guys out there today like Dr. Tom Wadsworth who have been making waves online, and a lot of people seem to like his content. A lot of people want to justify not going to church anymore, and others have a bone to pick with today's structure of the church. A lot of people ask, are there issues with the church today? Of course there are. Now, is everyone wrong as Dr. Tom Wadsworth claims? Well, no. You see, I've been attending church from a very young age, and a lot of the churches that I have gone to do follow that New Testament model that we find there in the scriptures. He also criticizes lexiconists because according to him, they mistranslate 5 Greek terms into English as worship. And Tom is correct in saying that there are different terms from Greek into English, but to say that they are mistranslated is not the full story. What I'm going to lay out is that the early church definitely had a spiritual worship happening when they were gathering together. The term that we're going to look at here in John chapter 4 is the Greek term proskuneo, which means to bow down. It's to have reverence, worthiness to someone or something. And so let's jump into John chapter 4 and break this verse down. Jesus said, "Everyone who drinks of this water will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I give him will never thirst again." Now, what is happening here is that Jesus is now spiritualizing, if you want to look at it this way, this conversation. Because the reality is that the water here, this is not now this physical water that woman is there, Jesus is there, and she's drawing water from that. He's not talking about that water anymore. He is talking about a different water, a spiritual water. Yet he's still using those Greek terms, water here, and of course that can't be that liquid water that is in front of them when they're having this conversation. So he's spiritualizing this verse right here. Now verse 23 tells us this: "But an hour is coming, and now is, when the true guy that bows down," and that's in the Greek, "will proskuneo the Father in spirit and in truth. For such people the Father seeks to be his proskuneo." Now, this is one thing I want you guys to understand. Here Jesus is saying, but an hour is coming and is now when the one that bows down will bow down, right? The Father in spirit and in truth. Now Jesus is saying, hey, this is going to happen in spirit and in truth. And what Dr. Tom Wadsworth likes to say is that right here, it's still prostration, it's still bowing down. But if that is so, then why is the Father still seeking people to be his proskuneo, people that will bow down? You see, what's happening here is that Jesus is transforming what they're used to, what they're used to doing at the temple with what they're going to be doing in the future. And so right here, when you read it as prostrating or bowing down, that right there does not make any sense. So the question is, do we worship when we come together as the church? Yes, there is edification with one another, but there is also that reverence that we have to God. And that's okay. So right here, when the translators and the lexiconers are translating these terms, proskuneo, as worship, there's no problem, because bowing down, the essence of bowing down, the reason why they bow down is because there is a reverence, there is a worthiness to that person that they are bowing down. And so that, my friends, here wraps up this video. Did the early church worship? Yes, they did.